Thank you to the students in particular for supporting the strike, because I can't tell you how much it means, particularly when a lot of people walk past us and it can be frustrating, so we really, really appreciate your support. And thank you to those who have organised this. So my presentation, I should say I'm Remi Joseph-Salisbury, I'm based in sociology, work on racism in education. A lot of my stuff is on racism in higher education. It would have been logical for me to present on this. That's what I was thinking when I was hearing you present, Nadeem. But I think as part of the strike, it's good for us to look a little further than what's going on in higher education as well. Like, there's a lot going on. So I wanted to talk about racism in secondary schools in particular, and also the plans to bring more police, a greater police presence into secondary schools. Have people heard these stories about more police in schools? Well, it's happening. These are all headlines. I should say the presentation is based on an article that I've been writing, working on over the last year or so. Been delayed somewhat by the strikes, but that's all good. Okay, so I'll talk about the political context, the research itself, the research that it's based on, critical race theory, which is kind of where I'm coming from, and what that tells us about, or what indications that might give us about the implications of placing police in schools. And then I'll move on to some perspectives from teachers that I spoke to about this issue. Okay. So just to reiterate that this is happening, it's not just started in the last few years, it's been ongoing for quite a long time, but just over the last 2 years, in 2018, we've got a youth violence committee suggesting that there should be a police officer attached to every primary and secondary school in the country. A year later, there's a Home Affairs Committee on serious youth violence, and they're saying that by the beginning of April 2020, which we're nearly at, there should be police in every school in an area with above average risk of serious youth violence. And we'll talk about the ways that's racialised and classed later. Just a few months later, there's a report from the Office for the Children's Commissioner. It's called, rather euphemistically, a manifesto for children. So this is in children's interest to have more police in school. And then it's back, it's not just in areas of high deprivation, but in every single school there should be a police officer. And even into 2020, Cressida Dick, the head of the Met Police, has said again, emphasis on again, she has been banging this drum for years now. In all of these reports, there's reference to Cressida Dick calling for more police in schools. She's raised it again in 2020. And vowed to increase the number in London. But of course, if she's making these noises in London, then it's going to affect the rest of the country as well. And of course, the wider political context, we've got a Conservative government, which is significant. I think as part of what saw this government elected, a small part of it, but a significant part nonetheless, they vowed to increase police numbers by 20,000, invest more than $1 billion in policing, and increase police stop and search powers. And I think that's part of what led to him being put forward as the Conservative leader. There's also, and I think this is really, really significant, $2.5 billion to be invested in the creation of 10,000 new prison places. If we've got prison places, those places are going to need to be filled. So we can already start to see that there might be some kind of link to placing police in schools. And Priti Patel said time and time again that the Conservatives plan to be the party of law and order. And she wants criminals, literally, to feel terror. Of course, we can discuss what actually is a criminal, and through the eyes of the Conservative Party and the state generally, these are often quite racialised and classed depictions of who is a criminal. But, and I think this is important as well for us to acknowledge, there's no political opposition in our parliamentary politics. The Labour Party, there's no opposition from the Labour Party on this. So as much as I try to work a critique of the Conservative Party into every single thing I ever talk about, Labour are not offering as much here. This is Angela Rayner in July of last year in her constituency, very happily chatting to the police about this movement to placing more. I say that, and I've put parliamentary in brackets here because I think it's important that although there's very little parliamentary opposition, there is building opposition in social movements and activist groups. But the wider picture is looking increasingly punitive and authoritarian. So that's the context in which I think we should understand calls to place more police in schools. And just to reiterate that it's also coming from the liberal left and far more widely than we'd like. So the research so far on the placement of police of schools is in the UK is almost non-existent. There's a real lack, quite a shocking lack. I was really surprised to see how little there was out there. What is out there is often reports that have been commissioned by the police, or they're in police's interest, they're conducted by former police officers or acting police officers. And often there's some really good literature in the US. The few examples of critical research in the UK, they're very London-centric, but they also focus on class rather than race. There's very little discussion of what it means for racialised groups to have more police in schools. And there's also a lack of insight from teachers, students and parents. We know the police's perspective, but we don't know how those in schools, those with children in schools are feeling about it. So my project, as some of you know, I've been working on a project looking at race and racism in schools. I've been interviewing secondary school teachers across Greater Manchester. I didn't go into these schools intending to research the impact of police, but every time I went to a school to meet a teacher for an interview, there's a police officer in reception or something going on that involved the police. Every time I'm interviewing a teacher, I look out the window and there's a police car driving into the school. So it's something that really couldn't ignore. I can't tell you how stark it is going into schools, sitting in reception, very predictable that a police officer will be there very soon. Very rarely dealing with an issue as well, just being a presence, making sure people know that they're there. So I interviewed 24 secondary school teachers and one librarian from across these schools. I also had results from a Freedom of Information request last week. Greater Manchester Police are notoriously slow in responding. They don't respond in anywhere near the amount of time they're supposed to. And this response said that there are plans for 20 more police in Greater Manchester schools over the next school year. And they will be in the schools with the most need. I'm not sure what that means, but I'm sure we can guess. This Freedom of Information request, it also said that this is in addition to the long-standing relationships between schools and police. So a lot of this literature and political discussion is critical of school-based police officers. Basically, police officers in school with an office in the school, and their day-to-day job is in the school. But I think what it misses is part of what I saw at these interviews, that police, They might not be based in the school, but as part of their daily rounds, they go into these schools and spending a significant amount of their time in there. So we've got two strands of it, those that are based in schools, paid by the schools, and those who are seeing the school as a significant part of their daily rounds. And a lot of my research is influenced by critical race theory, so what I've tried to do with this work is bring a critical race theory perspective to looking at the implications of police in schools. Any questions so far? Okay. Not said much yet, have I? They'll come. So critical race theory, for those who are not familiar with it. Nicola Rollock and David Gilbourn, two writers on racism in education, they say that it offers a radical lens through which we can make sense of, deconstruct and challenge racial inequality in society. It recognises racism as deeply embedded in societal structures and institutions, it's ubiquitous and endemic to the point that it's normalised and invisible. So racism is so widespread, we don't even see it. It's just there every day. It's built into the way our schools operate. It's built into the way our police operate. We take it for granted. Generally, and for the thinkers that I draw on, an understanding of white supremacy is central to CRT analysis. Does anyone want to have a go at what I mean by white supremacy? Not someone who was in my class last week and I told you just last week. Anyone?
Like to dominate. So white is the domination of non-white people, violence defined by white people.
Yeah.
The domination of who is not white by who is white, or something like that.
Yeah, so domination and power are really central to it. The reason I always pause to clarify is sometimes you're mistaken for speaking about the KKK or the EDL or even Boris Johnson, Donald Trump. These people are symptoms of it, and they are, I would say, I'm sure we'd all agree, white supremacist in their ideologies, but they're not the entirety of what white supremacy is. So I think of it more as a system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources, conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement are widespread, and this operates across a broad array of institutions. Key to those institutions is education and policing. So that's the kind of definition I'm working with. And from a critical race perspective, in the UK specifically, schooling and policing have been the two key sites for the perpetuation of white supremacy, two key sites of struggle for Britain's black communities. Okay. That's not supposed to be there yet. I was supposed to click and that last line was supposed to come up. But I don't have time to prep slides because I'm on strike, so forgive me. So the critical literature on racism in education, David Gilbourn perhaps being the foremost thinker, would say that schooling is underpinned by white supremacy. Rather than being benign or race neutral or meritocratic, schooling actively reproduces race and class inequalities. Some would say its purpose is to reproduce these inequalities. I don't think it really matters so much whether it's the purpose or not, it's the outcome. I think that's what's significant. Whether through action or inaction, the outcome is the reproduction of inequality. The way it does this is through the illusion of meritocracy. So we put people into this meritocratic vessel and expect and assume that the outcomes are meritocratic. It almost offers the legitimation of those inequalities. So there's a wealth of research to show that white supremacy manifests at almost every level. I can send the slides if you need them when I'm off strike. We see it in education policy. You know, David Gilbourn says education policy is an act of white supremacy. Teaching and pedagogy, the teaching workforce, you know, the proportion of staff from certain backgrounds. Disciplinary procedures is a big one where we really see it, and I think it's important for the purpose of thinking about police in schools. And school policies, you know, why certain hairstyles seem to be outside of school uniform policies. I should have said as well, to nod back to Nadim's presentation, the reason I've spoken about white supremacy in schooling rather than white supremacy in education is to be very specific in what I'm talking about, to acknowledge that education is something much vaster than what happens in our schools. Yeah, and you know that's kind of in a critical tradition of making this distinction. And in terms of disciplinary procedures in schools, we see that the most recent data, mixed white and black Caribbean and black Caribbean pupils are almost 3 times more likely to be excluded than their white peers. Figures even higher for Gypsy and Roma traveller communities. I think that's almost at 4 times more likely, but the population is significantly smaller. So the reason I'm talking about schooling broadly is because this is one of the key institutions that's implicated in this policing school. Yeah. Basic line is that schooling is underpinned by white supremacy, which is essentially my basic line on policing and my basic line on everything. So you can guess where I'm going. But Lisa Long, in her book Perpetual Suspects, she says that the function of the police is to protect the status quo. And that status quo, in Bell Hooks' words, via Lisa Long, is white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. So their function is to protect inequality. Alex Vitale, writing The End of Policing, which I would recommend, he says the reality is that police exist as a system for managing and producing inequality. It's essentially what I said about schools as well. By suppressing social movements and managing the behaviour of poor and non-white people. Yeah. So this understanding of policing, I think, is what we need to grasp to think about what policing schools will actually do. And every possible metric you can find in terms of policing in the UK points to racism in the police. Stop and search, black people are 9.5 times more likely to be arrested, more likely to be tasered, more likely to be killed due to police force. Once they're in courts, they're more likely to be sentenced more harshly for the same crimes, more likely to be incarcerated. I could go on. I don't think there are any anomalies in there. That's going to go on YouTube and someone's going to get back to me with some anomaly they've found. In terms of stereotype, black people are always already imagined as the criminal. Yeah? Under the white gaze, the white institutional gaze of the police, black people are criminal or prone to criminality. Any black person who deviates from this is the exception. Yeah? And of course that impacts upon schooling. It's the same logic that leads to those high rates of exclusion. Okay, so they're the 2 broad institutional contexts. In terms of policing in schools specifically, it emerged in the 1950s through essentially real concern about Britain's youth, being criminal, prone to disorder, and the police or state response to this was to engage in liaison work, and for this liaison work, working with communities specifically to target young people. So it's kind of got a bit of a welfare history in terms of supposedly being non-punitive, working closely with communities. It emerges in the 50s, and it's this that led to direct access for police into schools. Of course, around this time, it wasn't race neutral either. It was shaped by white supremacist ideology and concern about Britain's black population. Yeah? At this time, the state is incredibly concerned about what black people in Britain are doing. So that youth liaison work coexists with police efforts to engage in community relations work, to manage the black population, to mediate its opposition and distrust, as Lewis Gordon puts it. So this panic around youth and this panic around black communities mean that it's black youth in particular at the intersection of this panic that are affected. Yeah. So police in schools emerge in this context. It wasn't until 2002, though, that we got the direct placement of police in schools. And this came under New Labour with this tough on crime agenda that there are parallels with conservative rhetoric now in terms of being tough on crime, the party of law and order, however they put it. And what's often, or what's not discussed hardly at all in the literature, is the impact of Islamophobia. So since those early stages, it's become entangled with counter-terror legislation and the stereotyping of Muslim communities, and particularly the prevent duty. So part of why police are in schools now, or part of what they're tasked with doing, is in adherence to prevent. Do people know what prevent is? Just in case, it's it's part of counter-terror policy, and it places a duty on certain institutions, schools and universities, and the NHS being amongst them, to monitor for signs of radicalisation. Some horrendous stories of young people having the police called for misspelling the word terrorist in terraced house. It impacts upon universities, it impacts upon the scholarship of people working in these areas, and Muslim scholars particularly. So this is happening in school. In schools, it's more likely to impact upon Muslim school students. So police are there looking for these signs of radicalisation. Okay, so teacher perspective. As I said, I noticed the police officers at reception and then asked teachers about it once we got into the interview. I was pleased, I think, to see that teachers are generally in opposition to this, even though what we're seeing in the media is very, very little political opposition, very little critical writing at all. But the teachers I spoke to were pretty concerned. It's not what they wanted for their schools. So I'll talk about some general issues, then racialised issues, and then some of the teachers that were slightly more sympathetic to this idea. I wish that I'd asked at the start if anyone thought it was a good idea, but now I've kind of shown all my cards. So, but I think there is a general imagination, even on the left, that this could work. There are ways in which we could do this. That
I was just going to say that I was one of the people thinking, oh yeah, that might be a good idea to have police officers in schools, because I had a police officer in my school. But then I started to realise, I remember I went to a school where there was only one non-white family. So it's natural for that to feel, or it's like that's become more normalised. So I was going to ask, like, do you think that support is relative to the profile and demographic of a particular school?
The placement of police?
Both the placement of police and the support from teachers of it, or teachers that are sympathetic to the idea.
I think it definitely shapes it. I think it definitely shapes where police are going to be placed. And a lot of the teachers, they spoke about their specific demographic and how it impacts upon the students in their schools. But when a few slides on, I'll say what the teachers thought were positives. I'll be interested to hear if they're the same as, maybe what you were thinking, maybe what you're still thinking. I'm already assuming I'm going to convince you. So this teacher, Hayley, she works in a relatively mixed school. She's a white teacher. And her concern is that it's criminalising kids. She says, you should come to school because it's a positive place to be. It's not a prison. I don't really like it. I think it's pushing the issue away from where it should be. Schools should be free to do what they need to do and to put appropriate discipline in place. It's not the police's job. Yeah. Any comments on that? Okay. This was a really... Go ahead.
You mentioned what appropriate discipline was.
Yeah.
No, but no, I'm not sure. I don't think she did. She was concerned about the rate of exclusions in the school and how quick they were to turn to relatively punitive modes of punishment. This is another thing that's maybe worth thinking about. Even when the police aren't in school, part of the way that discipline is being carried out can still be really, really authoritarian, can still involve these people being sectioned in certain parts of the school that...
Implying that the police would have some involvement in the disciplinary procedures of the school.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is part of the problem where it is really blurry, and they've seen this in the US. Like, what's the line between a behavioural issue and a criminal issue? And that escalation can have quite devastating consequences.
I'm a child, and no cops involved. It's just like, you two go and chill out, don't fight again. But cops there, it's like that's a criminal. Like if there's legislation,
Yeah.
there's been a criminal assault.
And in so many different ways as well. So if the police officer, even with the best intentions, tries to intervene and the young person feels aggrieved and then ends up arguing with the police officer, you know, that's an escalation. Where does that end? And there are examples of this happening in the US, and very, very minor schooling issues leading to arrest and all kinds of problems. So the teachers imagined the school as a place that was antithetical to the logic of policing. They saw the school environment as something that should be savoured, a space for learning and developing together. They also felt that placing police in schools in and of itself criminalises young people. It signifies suspicion that those young people will not behave, and that message will be transmitted to young people themselves. So those low expectations will be internalised by walking past police officers on your way into school. And this report here, ACLU, this is US based, but they talk about this blurred line between school disciplinary procedures and criminal issues. And this idea of school to prison pipeline is quite significant when we're thinking about this blurry line. A lot of the literature in the US has focused on this problem and suggested that police in schools can directly feed people into prisons. And that's why I think it's important for us to think about those 10,000 more prison places when we're thinking about more police in schools. I think the term is fairly self-explanatory, but the NAACP define the school to prison pipeline as it's partly me as well, a racialised and class system through which the punitive and overzealous tools and approaches of the modern criminal justice system seep into our schools, serving to remove children from mainstream educational environments and funnel them on a one-way path towards prisons. And Karen Graham, she spoke at one of our seminars just a little while ago, and she suggested that although we talk about this in the US, we have a school-to-prison pipeline here in the UK. We just need to start talking about it. And I think there's evidence to support that. Here in the UK, we incarcerate a higher proportion of our black population. We have the highest rates of incarceration in Western Europe. So, and we have a higher rate of privatised prisons than in the US. So everything's there to suggest that we have a problem here that we need to pay attention to. Okay, and this quote is kind of moving us from the general, and by general I mean recognising that this is a problem for all students. This is something we should be opposing generally, regardless of race or class. But now starting to bring race and class into it. Leroy, black teacher in an increasingly black school. He says, I think the relationship between the police and the community are good. I'm not sure I agree, but this is what he says. I don't think that should be forced into a school setting. He says kids find them safe spaces, especially kids who are from deprived areas. Even though they might see school as crap at the time, they see it as a safe space. And you only see the kids who are hanging about are the kids who don't want to go home. I think that speaks volumes, and I think you could bring the police into that. There's probably animosity between certain groups and police, and I don't think that's going to solve it. So a lot of the rationale for placing police in schools has been about safety. And Leroy here, I think, pushes us to thinking about whose safety is that? Who do the police make feel safe? Who has a sense of safety from a police presence? And I think working class communities, and particularly black and brown communities, are far less likely to feel that sense of safety. And the history of policing shows us that they're quite right to feel unsafe around the police. Any comments there? If anyone has any different analysis of the quotes, please tell me, because I'm working on an article so I can take your ideas.
Just on safety, like the arguments about safety, and we're very quick to put police officers in schools, but we're not quick to put paramedics in or doctors or...
One of the teachers, that's one of my favourite lines from the interview, a teacher said exactly the same. If we're concerned about safety, it's far more likely to have an injury that requires a paramedic, yeah.
I have a mate's dad who's sort of the head teacher of a pupil referral unit.
Okay.
I'm speaking to him whenever he's really quick fire on bringing the police and anything slightly sensitive enough. All the sorts of high on the table.
Yeah, it's the way our society is set up. If something goes wrong, it's often the course of action to take, especially if you're in a professional capacity and you're looking to cover and protect your own back. But a lot of the teachers I spoke to as well said even having to call the police is better than this of actually having the police on site with permanent presence. Okay, so a lot of the teachers went to great lengths to point out that it wouldn't be race neutral, the implications wouldn't be. So Amir, again in a predominantly white school, he said if teachers or staff might hold racist views, for the students, their experience of the police might be a negative one. I think generally it will be a negative one in terms of trends of stop and search. Who is it reassuring? The police are not part of the school, they're not part of the school body. So he's saying that there's already evidence of negative perceptions amongst teachers of the black students, black and Asian students. We see that in policing in terms of stop and search. So how is this combining a police and school is going to have positive outcomes for these students? Again, he's asking who is it reassuring, which I think is a really, really important question for us to think about. Who is it reassuring to have more police in schools? And then Haley, white teacher in a predominantly white school. I can understand that stop and search means black students feel more threatened by a police presence. I don't think the average white lad in my school would probably even notice if we had a police officer around. I'm not sure how true that is because I think class is a factor here too, but there is something in there that's worth us thinking about. The police are not perceived by us all in the same way. Lisa Long again talks about this in her work. She shows that for black communities, the police are not a symbol of safety or reassurance. And she also, along with people like George Yancey, says that sense of fear, of not feeling safe around the police, is entirely justifiable. It's empirically justifiable. And then this is a significant point as well. Becky, white teacher, predominantly black school. I think if we're going to have police officers in school, then they should be in every school, but they're not. They're only in schools in areas of high deprivation. And what does that say to the children walking into the school every day? So the reports from Serious Youth Violence are suggesting they should be in areas of high deprivation, metropolitan areas. They're going to be working class areas with majority black and Asian, or a disproportionate number of black and Asian students within them. So not only is there a problem within the schools, there's a problem in terms of which schools are being policed. Of course, once a school begins to be policed, criminal activity is going to be found, and it perpetuates this cycle of stigmatising certain schools, certain students. And then it means this idea of this school to prison pipeline is not just from every school, it's from schools for Manchester, it's from schools in Moss Side and Hume. That pipeline is missing affluent white areas and going directly to the prison from black communities. And in doing so, is perpetuating the logic of white supremacy. It's showing that black people are criminal. And this is some of the more generous interpretations. So police being in schools in a kind of non-punitive capacity. This was Martin, a black mixed race teacher in a majority black, Asian and Roma traveller school. says there's a notion that's been lost in this country of community policing, that a police officer is a member of the community, and that person is somebody that you should encounter, not just in the context of them telling you not to do things or arresting you for doing things, but because they're a member of the community. And they are contributing to the community in just the same way the bin man is, or the pharmacist is, or the local councillor is. You know, all part of the community, and in that respect, I think there's an opportunity created by having a police officer in schools to introduce some of that sense of police work back into perspective for pupils who may only otherwise encounter the police in a negative context. What do people think?
He does make a relatively, like, you know,
It's reasonable, right?
Like, it's just not the reality at all. You know, great if we did have community policing.
Yeah.
Fine, but it's just absolute nonsense.
What's the biography
Of this teacher?
in general, the teachers that you interviewed,
Um,
have they ever encountered police violence themselves? Or
so this person, no, not police violence. There was the teachers from BAME backgrounds were generally more critical, particularly those that had come from over-policed communities historically. There were also quite a lot of white teachers who were critical of it. There wasn't a very, very clear pattern, but some had far more generous interpretations of the police than others. Some of them had learnt through their young people as well. So there's a few white teachers who said before teaching they had a more generous interpretation of the police, but teaching black boys in a working class area of Manchester who are late for school because they've been stopped and searched, or they see being stopped on their way home from school, had changed their perception. A lot of them spoke about when they'd had people from the law department here actually go in and do a session with the young people, ask about stop and search, and every black boy's hand is up in the room that they've been stopped and searched. And that had really begun to change people's perceptions on what the police do.
One of my best mates is a maths teacher, and he teaches at the school we went to as kids. Back then, when we were kids, there was a police presence there. So there's a couple of things that we talk about when teachers aren't necessarily as critical as they should be. One is that a lot of the time, if they've gone to a school as pupils and the police have been there, they've been the ones that keep their head down. So they're not the ones that are exposed to this more. And two, I remember me and my mate briefly talked about this, and he said that there's almost an attitude that if you criticise the police presence, that's criticising the school and criticising the education system. So teachers won't speak out about this because there's a job security there, because you'd be looked at as from like the leadership as someone who is trying to deviate from the modus operandi of the school and the way it wants to teach children. So I think it's like...
Yeah, and if it's framed as being about safety, what teacher wants to stand up and say, oh, I don't care about safety. Like this.
Safety for the teachers as well, because that's one of the easiest ways they win the people over. They say, well, we'll put this police presence there. It's not just for the people's safety, it's for your safety, and it's not to monitor them, it's just to protect people, it's just to protect the children from the outside.
Yeah. The other interesting thing about this interviewee, I have to convert the names from the pseudonyms back to the names and then remember who it is and picture the conversation. But this person was incredibly critical on almost everything. They spoke about the absence of histories of colonialism in the curriculum, on everything. I think politically, myself and the interviewee were really, really closely aligned, apart from this. And there was a few people like that who generally, even identified as anti-racist, were critical of low teacher expectations, issues with the curriculum, but in terms of policing, they didn't necessarily see this immediately as a problem. But again, these are the minority. The majority of teachers I spoke to we're concerned about it. So what I would say about this, Lewis Gordon and others have said that this idea of community policing as some kind of golden age, it never really existed in the UK. We've never really had this amazing, well, I'm not sure it'd be amazing anyway, but the way it's portrayed, where police are just, you know, our next door neighbours and our good friends and we can all get along, it's never really been the case, and it's particularly never been the case for working class communities of colour. So I think that's worth bearing in mind. But also, what community policing actually does is a mode of data and intelligence gathering. It's an intrusive form of policing. It might be seen as a soft form of policing, but more critical takes would be that it's incredibly intrusive. It's coercive. But yeah, and again, thinking of counter-terror policing, it's been incredibly destructive in Muslim communities in the UK. So I think we should push back on some of this. And as McQuaid says, writing in the US, it deepens criminalisation and expands police power. So it's increasing the role of the police into our everyday lives. This was a big one. People said, why not have police? They can perform the role of a counsellor, youth worker, mentor. They can be mentors for the young people. They can be positive role models. I think the response here is pretty self-explanatory. One of the other respondents, so why would you pay for a police officer to come into a school when you've got £30,000 a year? That money could go to better things. Of course, those better things would be paying a teacher's salary and another teacher in the school. And I think if you put that to most teachers, this money, because the £30,000 comes from the school, yeah, that money, an extra teacher in a school, or a youth worker, or a counsellor. I think politically, if we're organising around these issues, that is an argument that we can make. The other thing as well is the police, the way the police operate, law enforcement is central to that. So even if the police attempt to act in these more social youth work type roles, too often, and this is what the evidence in the US shows, they'll revert back to the policing role. As soon as there's a minor disciplinary issue, the police will revert back to what is their instinct, and that's often perpetuated by a lack of guidance and consistency in terms of what the role of the police is. Also, the young black boy who's stopped 20 times in a week, does he really want to be going to a police officer for kind of mentoring and youth work? I don't really think so. And then, so this is on the yellow, the other bits are not supposed to be up yet, but I messed it up a bit. This person says, I think it would be a good thing for our students to be able to learn to know the police, to break down the barriers, and to get rid of this them and us kind of anti-establishment feel. Humanise the police and things like that. This should be part of the role of having police in schools, to humanise them. And she continues, humanise the children, because you can see some of our kids, and I guess if I didn't know them, if I wasn't a teacher and I saw a 6'5" black lad in a hood, maybe I'd feel intimidated. So if I was a copper, I might stop and search them. But because of the job that I do, I just know that they are just little boys. They are just kids. So yeah, maybe that opportunity would be two-way, and that maybe the police could work more with these kids and see that they are just a little boy. So it's based on this assumption that young people's anti-establishment feel isn't legitimate. Like, young people might well have a good reason to feel this way. It implies a false equivalency between the students and the police. It erases the power, the differences in power in these situations. And it shouldn't be the responsibility of individual black students to show the police that they are humans. It's also really interesting that I think the quote seems to suggest that the only way for the black person not to be a criminal is to become a boy. There's no situation in which you could be a black man or a black adult. I'm saying man because they're talking about a black boy. There's no situation in which you can be a black man who is not a criminal. The only way is to be infantilized into being a black boy. And if you're just a little black boy, then maybe you're not a criminal yet.
It's a weirdly maternal form of racism.
Yeah, it's
sexualized as well.
yeah. And this, you know, how many 6'5" black lads are there? You know, that's very tall. That's very tall. We know there's evidence that teachers and police officers see black kids as being far taller than they are anyway, and it's tied to this kind of idea about black people being dangerous and.
6'5" at like 14, 15.
Yeah, I never made it. I never made it to 6'5". Okay, so placement of police in schools is a threat to learning environments, and I think teachers generally were pretty unanimous on that point, even those that had more generous interpretations. It's tied to this schools to prison pipeline. I think it's important that we remember that. If more prison places are created, they're going to be filled, and police in schools are a part of that picture. It's particularly acute for working class and racially minoritized students. And even under these non-punitive rules, I think the risks and problems are still there. Disciplinary issues, minor disciplinary issues can still escalate into these criminal issues. And I think it's something that needs to be resisted. There's a couple of groups that tomorrow night will be launching a campaign to get police out of schools. Kids of Colour and Northern Police Monitoring Project, they're both based in Manchester, so if you're on Twitter or whatever, have a follow, and I think the details should be announced tomorrow night. Hopefully you think it's worthy of support. Thank you.
So in the context of like academies and stuff in the UK, I'm not entirely sure how they work, but those sorts of water governors and deputy sort of management that run things behind the scenes. So I mean, what's their role in that? Is there, if you know, do you have any data? I presume they're mostly white men as well.
Yeah, so school governors are, disproportionately white and middle class, as you'd expect. I think that is an avenue. If we were thinking about a campaign targeting school governors to oppose it, they would have some say over this. They would have say in several areas of their job. So one is in terms of thinking about the budget, but also they have some say in disciplinary procedures. And so in those two avenues, they would have something to bear on this. The governor boards for academies are often shaped by the academy's interests. So it'd be a difficult one, but I think governors is one way to challenge it. Oh, we'll go in this.
So I'm curious about the formal role that police officers have in schools and like how they make themselves visible. You mentioned that they would just turn up at reception sometimes, and like in the US, it's pretty common to have metal detectors and to have like basically every school has to walk past the police officer on the way. And there are metal detectors and bag searches, and then obviously there's racial profiling that comes with that. So it's like on a daily basis, students are reminded that police officers are present, that they have power over them, and that they have this formal role that they occupy. So like are the police officers in, like is the proposal for police officers to have a similar formal role as town offices or just wandering the halls?
The proposals are for police officers to have a more permanent presence. It's not clear. I think in some places it might be split between schools, so they might have 2 days in one, 3 days in another, but a relatively permanent presence, I imagine, with an office. I keep speaking as if this is something that's happening in the future. It's already happening in a lot of schools. It's just going to increase. So there's that in terms of a really obvious, visible presence where the salary generally comes from the school. There's also the less spoken about, slightly more subtle, where it's just built into police officers' rounds. So a police officer that's working in Gorton, as part of their daily beat, they will stop at the schools and spend an hour or two there. I think it's really important that we see that as part of the picture, because if we just focus on the school-based police officers, I think the state's response will be just to increase the amount of school visits on the police officers around and work around it that way. We're asking a bit about what they actually do in the school as well. Is that? I think we have the metal detectors at some schools.
It's more like what are students' experiences of police officers in schools? Like, do they see this person as, say, a member of staff who has a specific authority over them, or is it more that like they're being monitored in a less formal way?
Yeah, I think this is another big part of the problem, that the guidance for police officers is really unclear. Teachers' understandings of their role is unclear. Police officers' understandings of their own role is unclear. And I think the US literature suggests that this lack of clarity just sees police officers just return to their kind of punitive policing type role. So it's really, really poorly defined. I don't want to get into calling for clearer definitions as the end goal, but I do think the ambiguity of the roles is exacerbating the problem as well. So you had your hand, didn't you? And then.
So sort of school unions, like teachers' unions, are they reacting at all to positive or negative?
We're going to find out a lot more tomorrow when we launch this. I think I won't put this bit on YouTube too soon, but I think the NEU, the National Education Union, I'm pretty sure we're going to get their support with it, because, as I say, I don't think teachers don't want this, or a lot of teachers don't want it. So I think there can be enough support within the unions to get the union itself to take a stance against it. So although there's not been much campaigning yet, I think there's a lot on our side to wage a successful campaign. And yeah, the union, we do really need them on side.
Do you think, like, did you like ask any parents what they thought? Because I feel like a lot of the time, like, when you talk about what like the capacity of the police officer's role is, I remember, because we were the ones that had like, police officers, that they just stand outside the school gates, and I don't think that was actually for the pupils. I think that was more for the parents, so the parents could see that they were invisible going to the
Yeah.
So it almost feels like, as well as sort of the punitive policing measures, like you say, it's almost a real PR exercise for the white middle class parents that the police are actually have similar priorities to what they have. And
Yeah. I think the parents' view is something that there's hardly any research at all, so we don't know so much. Not through research anyway, we don't know what young students are thinking of it, and we don't know what their parents are. Roxy Legan, who is the director of Kids of Colour, she's done some work on this, and she's finding that there are parents, mainly black parents, who are very, very concerned about this, and young people who've had some pretty dreadful experiences. But still a lot more information needs to be gathered, and I think this is part of the issue with the state's approach as well. So there's not been any consultation, as far as we can see, with community groups.
That, like, this isn't the norm, because it was normalised in my school, and it was told that this is the norm that you want the police officer.
I think it went away a bit. I think it was relatively widespread. It went away, particularly amongst the cuts. So schools are cutting their budgets, and that's one easy way to go. But it's coming back, and it's probably looking like it's going to be more embedded. If we don't challenge it, it's going to be more embedded than it even was before. Time's precious, isn't it?
Do you have a question?
Well, yeah, of course.
Yeah, it's long. No, I wouldn't ask it.
Is it a challenging one?
No, like, throughout the whole presentation, I thought this must have such a huge psychological impact on the students.
Yeah.
Being criminalized has, like, the consequence of being criminalized can lead to further criminalization.
Yeah.
So of course, like, we place we all on the same side. But of course, we have to understand that and
It's hard to get a grip of how far the consequences might be, because the negativity of it can be internalised and impact upon educational outcomes, which puts you at more risk of being criminalised. But the internalisation can also lead to a greater propensity to engage in criminal activity more directly. And those are the kind of intangibles that I guess we won't have a full grip on until things get a bit worse. You know, we can look to the US, and the research there shows it's really, really, really bleak. But it needs more people doing more work on it. And as I say, Roxy Legan's looking to speak to young people, and hopefully she's going to get PhD funding. But it's an important area that we're going to need to be more aware of, I think.
Thank you very much. I think the next one is very interesting.
Thank you, everybody.